Well, it's not directly dangerous if black counters it. It forces black to counter, because if he doesn't, white's attack can get pretty strong. Like, let's say he plays g6. After g6, I think white probably plays g5, and black takes it, let's say. Knight takes. Now f7 is under attack, so he has to guard it. Let's say rook e7. It's the only move, I guess, probably, yeah. And then maybe queen f3, hitting the knight on f6, bishop g7, knight g4, let's say. And now if black takes, then f7 hangs, so white can make an in-between capture on f7. I'm not sure when. Probably with the knight. It looks like pretty strong to take with the knight. And yeah, that looks winning for white. Well, there might be some tricks there, but in any case, I don't think he can take on g4. And then, for example, rook d7, knight takes f6, and if queen takes f6, queen h3, and white's winning here, actually, already. Threatening the rook, and the rook doesn't have any good spot to go to. If it goes to d8, I mean, knight h7 hits the queen, only move is queen e7, then bishop g5, and the game is over. Since there's a pin, and black can't play f6, and if queen d7, queen h4, threatening the rook, and also threatening, if the rook moves, to just play knight f6 and mate, or win black's queen. Black will be forced to take it, which will lead to mate. So that's just an example of how white's attack can develop if black doesn't counter in the center. So, of course, Ivanchuk made this classical counter. Knight d4, white took, black took, knight f5, and now again, he needs to attack the center. He played d5. If he doesn't, again, white's going to play g5 and force black to take, and the knight will be pinned, and white can use the open g file, and the strong bishop on b3. So black needs to attack in the center. And now came an interesting period in the game, which, well, it took me a little while to try to, I think I figured it out, why they use this move order here. Well, first of all, black, of course, is planning to just take on e4. So the natural move is e5, keeping black's bishop on b7 out of the game. Of course, white's bishop on b3 is also out of the game, but, you know, the position stays closed, and white tries to push his pawns on the king side. But I think the problem with this is then black plays the move bishop b4. And I think this is kind of awkward for white. First of all, we don't want to play bishop d2 because then he just takes it, queen takes, and then knight takes g4. And white doesn't appear to have any compensation. Or maybe he can take on d4, but then black can bring his queen over to h4, or maybe he can play c5, c4, and shut white's pieces out of the game. It doesn't look good for white in general. Rook e2, we don't want to block the queen's path to f3. The queen wants to go to f3 and develop the pieces that way and get over to the king side to attack. So rook e2 is a very awkward move to have to make, and black would play knight d7, hitting the e5 pawn, and then probably next c5 and c4, and it's just awkward for white to have the rook on e2. That's unpleasant. And meanwhile, the tactical blow, knight takes g7. Of course, we can't take the knight on f6 because the rook on e1 is hanging. With black's rook would take with check and win white's queen. But the tactical blow, knight takes g7, doesn't turn out well because black just takes it, and after e takes f6, queen takes f6, and then black takes over the game. You know, white would have to probably trade the rooks, but here black has a big advantage. White's king side is weakened, and black's queen is very strongly placed on f6, taking over squares. And, you know, bishop d6 is coming next, g4 pawn is hanging out, so it doesn't look good at all for white. He's too far behind in development. So that means that e5 probably would not be so good. So Svidler made the in-between move a takes b5, and now Ivanchuk made his own in-between move and took on e4. So this kind of perplexed me. I guess if he took back right away, the point is now rook takes a8, and then however black takes, with the queen or the bishop, then e5. And now bishop b4 doesn't work because of knight takes g7. And in this case, there's no queen guarding f6, or we'll see if the bishop had taken on a8. But anyway, king takes on f6 check. This doesn't turn out well for black now. For example, king takes, check on f3, king g7, bishop takes h6, and black loses, because if king takes, queen f6, king h7, queen takes f7, and rook takes e8. So that's an example. Okay, he doesn't have to take on f6 either, but in any case, white will be then up a pawn, and black's queen is far from his king side. So, and it's the same thing if the bishop were to take on a8. Same thing, knight takes, e5, bishop b4, knight takes g7, king takes, pawn takes, and now the queen can't take because the rook is hanging on e8. There's no longer a rook on a8 to recapture. So I think this is, I may be wrong, but I think this is the reason for the move orders that the players chose. It's very deep, actually, so, I don't know. But anyway, so now Ivanchuk, to avoid that, because if a takes b5, if we trade, let's say queen takes e5, knight d7, if he doesn't play bishop b4, probably this is a promising position for white, or at least he considered it to be less good for him than in the line that he got in the game. And maybe white can even take on d4 here. So that might be some of the reason. But anyway, so what he did, after he took on b5, is black took on e4. And now white took back on e4. And b takes a6, now getting some really crazy stuff, but this doesn't look too good for white because black can play e takes d3, and the white's a pawn is pinned, so the rook on a1 is hanging, white can't take the bishop, and then the whole long diagonal is opened up, and it's clear that white has no chances of a successful attack on black's king when the center is wide open and white's own king is so weak. So it looks quite bad for white, so I don't think he considered that. So he took on e4, and now black took back on b5. It wouldn't be good now, probably, for black to take on e4, because white can probably just take on a6 now, and then white's up a pawn in this case. And if black takes back, d4 is hanging. Meanwhile, yeah, it doesn't look too... maybe it's a possibility, but what he played was fine. He just took back on b5, white took the rook, the queen took, and now e5 finally. And here was an interesting moment. Black played knight e4, but I think the move bishop h1, which I'm sure he considered, of course, was this looks like a good move, and it looks like black probably, this was the correct response to white's crazy g4 move. It might be wrong, but it's threatening mate on g2, of course. Knight h4, it turns out, is the only move. If f3, of course, black just takes it, and that's bad for white. So knight h4 is the only move, and then you ask, what is the bishop doing on h1? It can just get trapped with f3, and that's what white's threatening, but black, acts concretely here. g5, threatening white's knight, and white has to play f3. If white takes on f6, then black takes on h4, and this is bad for white. There's no good way to stop the mate on g2, only his move is f3, and it's no good because black takes it, or takes the rook first. But anyway, so after g5, f3 is probably forced. G takes h4. Now again, taking on f6 is not good because black can trade the rooks and take on f3, and that's worse for white. So he takes the bishop, and now a good move is c5, and black is planning to shut out white's bishop with c4. Notice it's still even material, and white's king is more open, and black is just planning to play c4, and that's really a problem for white. And of course, knight takes g4 is also on the agenda. At the moment, it didn't work because of rook g1, but and now if white takes the knight, black can trade the rooks, take a pawn on f3, and then c4, hitting the bishop. And after the bishop, you just don't want to play a terrible move like bishop a2. And then the game would be over after, for example, bishop c5, I guess. Oh no, then there's queen e8 check, forcing black to return. So maybe something else. Maybe take on g4 first. But white's both bishops are just horrible, and then black can get back to this position. Maybe d3 right away. Yeah, d3 looks good. There's answer bishop e3, but then he takes on c2. It's just awful for white. So it looks like after bishop h1, black probably gets the advantage. But you see that Svidler's move g4 was not so terrible because black really had to find kind of an only path. Maybe he had some other options earlier, but he played knight e4, which is a very natural move. but I think it's okay for white here at least. It's very sharp, but it's still okay, I think. So after knight e4, now white played e6. Of course, this pawn is hanging. White needs to get his own attack going. It's going to turn into both sides attacking along the diagonals. Very strange type of game. Black, of course, has to take, and then knight takes d4. Now white's planning to just take on e6. Black needs to get his attack going, so he played a good move, rook to d8, pinning white's knight. And now Svidler made his own mistake, and this one could have cost him the game very quickly. He took on e6, but this pawn was not running away, and what he needed to do, and this is a very subtle mistake to make, and this is how top-level games are decided when they're decisive. g5 right away was much better, not allowing black the resource, which we'll see in a second. So he needed to get his attack going. He needed to go g5 first, but he decided to take the pawn on e6 first, and that turned out to be the wrong move order. So bishop takes e6 check, black played king h8, and now g5, and he needed to do this. He needs to expose black's king. Queen h5 is coming next. And now, however, Ivanchuk could have turned the tables with queen a4. Very strong move. Kind of weird to have the queen go this sideways like this. I don't know if he considered this move. It's probably he considered it, but I don't know. Maybe he missed something, and I believe he was in time pressure also by this point. So hitting the knight on d4, and if white plays c3 and guards it, he just trades queens in c5, and the knight is pinned and lost. If white plays, on the other hand, bishop e3 guarding it, then black, rather than c5, which would lead to problems after queen h5, c takes d4, queen f7, threatening mate on g8, instead of doing that, he doesn't have time for this c5 move. It's such a sharp position that there's not enough time to spend 2 moves to win a piece. Instead, what he needs to do is attack immediately with knight takes g5. So in these wild positions, sometimes 2 tempi are worth more than a piece. So here, black was threatening rook takes d4, winning the piece at no tempo cost, because of a fork on f3. So, for example, white does nothing. Whatever he does, let's make a pass move, h4 for instance. He takes on d4, hitting white's queen, bishop takes, and then in this case knight f3, and then taking d4, black wins, or taking e1 possibly also. So anyway, that's the threat. White would have to take that knight, but then rook takes d4, hitting white's queen, and of course the bishop is to a certain extent under attack. And now bishop d2 is forced. If something like queen h5, I think here black looks like maybe there's various ways to win, but g6 on the top of my head looks like a strong move, because if queen takes g6, rook g4 with the decisive attack for black. For example, bishop takes, queen takes, check, king f1, and then bishop g2 followed by mate, bishop f3 and queen g2. And there's some other defenses, but it looks bad for white. So bishop d2 would be the only move. And then this position, you don't want to go into it. It just looks horrible for white. Black's bishop on b7 is a monster. White's king is weaker. And actually black has he needs to line his queen up. He needs to get his queen into a better spot. He needs to get it to the long diagonal. So either b4 or queen a6. b4 looks like a very good move, threatening queen c6. And there's no way for white to challenge the long diagonal. His bishop is pinned on d2, and he basically is just losing here. It's in a bad position. So